Hello, everybody. Today I want to talk about a topic, the Korean War. And now you may be thinking, why did I choose this topic to talk about today? Well, I think the Korean War is really a substantial start into how South Korea really became its own. How it really grew into becoming what it is today. And now, to give you a little background, the cause of the Korean War. Well, to start it off, the cause of the Korean War starts around the end of World War II, after Japan and Germany was defeated by the Allied forces, and at that time Japan was in control of Korea. They were called the Chosen, and Japan had them as a colony. And after Japan was defeated, um, the United States and the Soviet Union began to look into Korea and what they could do to really fix what the issues were with Korea during this time. And so they split Korea in half, north and south at the 48th parallel, and the Soviet Union was in control of the northern side, as you can see right there on that little map. They were in control of the northern side, and what they were doing is they began to set up a communist regime in North Korea, as in South Korea, the United States was actually setting up a military kind of government, that was opposite of the way communism is, and it was more of a democracy than it was anything else. And going into the start of the war, so there's a tension that began to grow for about 5 years. From 1945 to 1950, there was a tension constantly between North Korea and South Korea, and especially along that border. And finally, June 25th, 1950 arrives, and North Korea decides to invade South Korea to kind of unite them under one, as in communism. And so then in the first few months of the war, so about 3 months in, June to around, I think, September-ish, there was just a pushback on the 30th parallel, which is the division of the North Korean South Korean border. And so it was just constantly just moving the chain back and forth. So there wasn't really any really big moves. But during this time period, they say around, they don't know the exact number, but hundreds of thousands of Koreans, civilian soldiers, even US and UN soldiers were killed during this time. And then in September of 1950, the United States, under General MacArthur, decided to drop U.S. troops behind the 30th parallel and behind enemy lines. And this really began to spark this kind of spiral. And before I really get into that, I just want to talk about the South Korean civilians, because that's what I really want to focus on, is South Korea and how they were really affected by this war, and how much damage it did, but how much it actually helped South Korea in the end for the future. And I just want to show you this chart really fast. Look at that. 600,000 North Koreans, just North Korean civilians alone, were killed or missing. 1 million South Korean civilians were dead or missing. And then you get into the military, missing and killed. 406,000 North Korean soldiers were killed, and 217,000 South Korean were killed. And then you go on to China, 600,000 Chinese soldiers were killed. In the United States, 36,000. And the UNC forces, so nations around the world, around 3,063. On top of that, there's millions wounded from North Koreans, and then South Koreans have almost 500,000. China has 716,000, and the United States have 103,000. 100,000. But one of the things that we really don't talk about when we talk about war history and just history as a total is the civilian side of things and how life for these civilians were really affected. And I just want to talk about the South Korean lives that were really impacted by this war. So, one of the things that the civilians were really worried about was just being murdered by these troops marching through their villages and also burning down their villages, losing their homes, lives, and just everything around them being destroyed. And, they lived in fear and chaos by being killed by either side of the war And there was an account of a child who lost both his parents. This was very common too. Lost both of his parents and he lived off the streets. Now, during this account, the little boy ended up finding an American soldier, and he stuck by him and lived in the barracks. But the American soldier couldn't adopt him, and so the little boy had to be put into a orphanage. But that's just one really sad story that comes along with war, is these children being left orphaned and no families left. But this was a common occurrence. And there was a common occurrence of massacres in these villages, just dead bodies all over the place, villages wiped out and burned. And the amount of civilians that were killed over the war is over 1.6 million people. If you think of that, that is the entire population of San Diego, the city of San Diego, all dead and more. That is a crazy amount of people if you really take that into perspective. And this war was 3 years long. And to get really back into the war, I'll show you this map right here. And you see they eventually get pushed all the way to the edge, almost losing Korea as a total. But in October of 1950, the South Korean and American forces pushed the North Korean and Chinese forces back past the 38th parallel, and there was a continuance of fighting. And then in November of 1950, the Chinese forces began to push the South Korean and American forces back all the way past Seoul. So they took the city of Seoul and they pushed them back into that little corner. And that's all they had. They were pushed all the way back there, past the 38th parallel. So South Korea almost became a lost cause. But in early 1951, the Chinese forces began to get really, really weakened. And so the United States Army and the South Korean Army decided to come together and that they were going to push back. And this fighting took from early 1951 all the way to July 51, where they finally take back the city of Seoul and they push the North Koreans and the Chinese back to the 38th parallel line. And so after that, it really just became a stalemate, fighting back and forth just between that 38th parallel line until Eisenhower gets reelected or elected and then on July 27th of 1953, an armistice was signed ending the organized military operations. So technically this war never ended, but the military side did. And so the fighting was stopped, and the border is now set at the 38th parallel, which is separated now known as the DMZ. And post-war South Korea, this is where we really start to see South Korea begin to develop. In the 1960s, before the 1960s, North Korea after the war was very prosperous. But 1960s hit, and South Korea began to industrialize, and they began to go under the United States wing, and they began to grow big and fast. And this led to South Korea becoming a big global player in the world, really changing how South Korea functions now and changing the cultural entirely in South Korea from just being this kind of keeping it to our own country to now becoming this world power kind of, which is really insane to think about how the post-war of this really changed it. And just to conclude, despite having this detrimental losses of over 2 million people being killed during this war, which is just a very, very sad amount. I think it gets close to 3 million or over. But it's such a sad thing knowing how many people lost their lives during this time period in just this 3-year war. But I think this war has really changed Korea in a big way. And I think it kind of pushed South Korea to become the big world power that it is now. And they haven't stopped modernizing since. And I really think the Korean War has had a major effect on how South Korea runs today. And here are my sources. I got a history channel directly from the Library of Eisenhower, Stanford, and many more. I thank you all for watching and listening to my student lecture. Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Rankin, for listening.